It seems that music has always been around. It wasn't invented any more than was fire and water. Music and its place in history is a series in 14 episodes. Its aim is to be a primer, or an overview, of music throughout history, offering an infinite number of triggers that could inspire more research and study. In the last couple of episodes, we have discussed the Romanticism that resulted from the changes and transformations occurring during the greater part of the 19th century. After 1870, Europe settled into a new period of stability and prosperity, known as the Belle Epoque in France, Pax Britannica in England, and the Gilded Age in America. The relative peace of the Golden Age lasted for more than 30 years, until the outbreak of World War I in 1914. By the late 19th century, Western music was being heard in many places around the world. It had become a classical concert tradition. Concerts and operatic performances were frequent in the performing spaces, courts, and salons, but there was another level of artistic energy in the streets and the countryside. A classical composer could easily encounter the folk music around them, and often it was a source of fascination and pride. The inclusion of folk music into a concert work was a form of preservation, and a vital one too, until at least the turn of the century, when it started to become possible to record such music by mechanical means. Mendelssohn honored the folk music of Italy in the Saltarella movement from his Symphony No. 4. Chopin wrote piano music based on Polish dances, the mazurka and the polonaise. Schubert enjoyed writing Ländler, a folk music style popular in the Austrian Alps. Brahms wrote folk-style Hungarian dances. Folk song, dance rhythms, and well-known hymns have been worked into musical composition as far back as the Middle Ages. Composers found inspiration in doing so. It was a device that also tended to please the audience by providing an element of familiarity or by offering something that was exotic or referential. By the later 19th century, the nationalistic fervor that energized the politics of the time gave purpose to the music written by composers who lived beyond the main European cultural centers. Russian composers imbued their orchestral music, songs, and piano music with the exotic sounds and stories of their nation. One of the most memorable of these is Modest Mussorgsky. His opera Boris Godunov, based on the story of that 16th century Russian Tsar, is Russian in character from beginning to end. And in the prologue's coronation scene, the well-known hymn Slava, meaning glory, is used to stir the emotions and to set up the story about this pivotal time in Russian history.
Бояр, париж
In Norway, Edvard Grieg's prized works include two suites that he extracted from the incidental music he wrote for the premiere performance of Peer Gynt, a Norwegian fairy tale that had been shaped into a play by Henrik Ibsen. Jean Sibelius's Finlandia, an orchestral tone poem written to honor Finnish history, concludes with a newly composed hymn that has become one of Finland's most important national songs. And tucked into a corner of the Austrian Empire was Bohemia, what is today known as the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Bedřich Smetana's Má vlast is a cycle of tone poems that musically depict locations and legends of his country. Antonín Dvorak, also from Prague, established his career with two sets of Slavonic dances, whose strong rhythms and energy enlivened the concert hall with a folk-inspired atmosphere. Dvorak took an academic post in New York City in 1892. This would have been the American practice of the day to hire Europeans for major music positions. From New York City, Dvorak wrote his New World Symphony, which is filled with his impressions of America. There is no hint of Bohemia in the work. Instead, Dvorak used the rhythms, scales, and phrase structures he heard in the Negro spirituals and Native American music. He wrote, quote, "I'm convinced that the future music of this country must be founded on the Negro melodies. These can be the foundation of a serious and original school of composition to be developed in the United States. These beautiful and varied themes are the product of the soil. They are the folk songs of America, and your composers must turn to them." End quote. Music of the soil is an interesting term that seems to capture the spirit of folk music. Whether it's a jig, a polka, flamenco, or a popular song or hymn, this music grows like a language or dialect, evolving slowly and burning deeper into the group's identity, and becoming inseparable from the mores, rituals, beliefs, religion, and practices of the people. Music of the soil is everywhere. To explore it, we venture into a topic referred to as world music. This presupposes that there is a fundamental difference between world music and Western classical music. True as that may be, we should try not to overstate the divide. European classical music is a world music too, in that it is a product of human culture. If music comes from people's values, society, and collective ideas and ideals, well then all of it is valid, and all of it is revealing. But for a music of the soil, it is less a product created by someone to be consumed by someone else, and more of a collective project, and often there is little to no separation between music maker and audience. And whereas Western classical music gets documented by notation, publication, and institutions dedicated to its performance, music of the soil is dependent upon somebody or some group advocating for it to make sure it gets researched and preserved. We will look more closely at these: China, India, Indonesia, and Africa. We'll discuss the Western Hemisphere later. China is a large country, and the broad palette of Chinese music reflects its history of influences, religious currents, economic variations, rituals, and social hierarchies. There is the remarkable throat singing of the Tibetan monks, the music and dance culture of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, the flirty work songs, Sanji, from the agrarian countryside of the Fertile East, the social ensemble music of the traditional tea house of Shanghai, and the formal tradition of the Peking or Beijing opera. To demonstrate some of the contrast, I'll share examples from Xinjiang and from Jiangnan. The Uyghurs live in the autonomous area of China in the western part of the country, bordering Mongolia and Kazakhstan. They are a Turkic people and are mostly Muslim, sharing many cultural traits with people of Eastern Arabia. The music usually involves dancing and group participation. Here is a field recording of a group dance. Perhaps you were aware of both Arab and Asian aspects in the rhythms, instruments, scales, and timbres. Many of the Uyghur instruments are close relatives to Arab and Central Asian zithers, lutes, and drums, and the melodies are built on scales of tetrachords and pentachords that often incorporate pitches that fall in between the notes of the Western scales. The music was heterophonic, meaning that many of the instruments were embellishing and personally expressing the same melodic line. Farther to the east in China, the many folk music styles often include the heterophonic texture, but the sound is very different, in part because the pentatonic scale permeates many of the melodies. In ensemble music, percussion is often incorporated as part of the accompaniment. Here is an example of ensemble music of Jiangnan Sizhu. Jiangnan is at the mouth of the Yangtze River and the territory neighboring it to the south. Sizhu literally means silk and bamboo, the silk referring to the strings of the stringed instruments like the erhu and the pipa, and the bamboo to instruments like the ditsa. Groups of players get together for tea or other social functions, especially in Shanghai. Heard on this recording are a ditsa, erhu, sanxian, yanjin, pipa, and percussion. The composition is called Song of Happiness. The traditions of music are changing fast. China has industrialized, and its population shifted from largely rural to largely urban. Since the Cultural Revolution of the 60s and 70s, China's strength has been rejuvenated with an abundance of trade with the West, and Western-style culture is as prevalent now as music of their traditions. Some of the music of ancient China is less practiced now, such as the solo qin, once considered a symbol of social refinement and status. India is another country with a large land mass and a large population. Folk music is regional, which in the north includes devotional songs with accompaniment by a stringed instrument, and this music frequently incorporates dance. Southern India was less influenced over time by Persia and Islam, so the traditions there developed differently. Here, folk music often involves a small ensemble of musicians, perhaps with the vocalist as a melodic leader, accompanied by a violin, a rhythm instrument, and a guitar-like instrument that provided a drone effect. Indian classical music is distinct from the country's folk traditions. It developed over thousands of years and is a specialized, even intellectual pursuit. Even in areas of the country where the population was illiterate, individuals engaged in advanced practice of Indian classical music. It evolved into two general styles, Carnatic in the south and Hindustani in the north. The sophistication of this improvisatory musical language is apparent. The tabla is dictated and maintained by the rhythm keeper, or tabla player. One can compare tabla to a meter or a metric pattern. The raga provides the pitch and melodic elements, and is stated by the melody instrument, such as the sarod or sitar. The sitar has movable frets that set the raga intonation, and the sarod has no frets. Tuning is therefore infinite, and the inflection of pitch makes the music microtonal as opposed to the West's more fixed system of 12 pitches between the octave. Both the sitar and the sarod have an extra set of strings that reverberate sympathetically, providing the music's distinctive drone. A performance always starts out simply. A patient introduction of the raga, followed by an introduction of the tabla. Then the improvisation begins. The two structural features are extensively explored, embellished, and expressed. We will listen to an excerpt from the middle of an 18-minute performance on the sarod by Ali Akbar Khan of Raga Chandranandan. In Indonesia, a unique kind of music evolved in the ancient courts of Java. The gamelan is an ensemble of gongs and metal xylophones tuned to very specific pitches and according to two distinct tuning systems. Other instruments might be used, like a bamboo flute and a stringed instrument, as well as non-pitched instruments. Some of the Javanese music is fully intended for outdoors, and therefore emphasizes the louder instruments. Singing is often part of the gamelan experience, too. On the neighboring island of Bali, the gamelan has evolved well beyond a ceremonial function. Here, the music can display a full range of sonic contrasts and dramatically exhibit advanced virtuosity and formal construction. The gamelan has received academic attention for its unique timbres and instruments, tuning systems, intonation variants, and practices of metric pattern and division. Africa, of course, is a continent of many places. It contains 200 distinct languages and cultures. The Sahara Desert is like a dry ocean that separates Mediterranean Africa from the rest of the continent. The continent's many national boundaries do not reflect the boundaries of its languages and cultures. We will concentrate on the Ewe culture of West Africa, the Shona culture around Zimbabwe, and the Mande culture around Mali. First, some generalizations. We often associate African music with its rhythmic vitality. This is a fairly reliable generalization. Rhythm is everywhere, in the work, in the language, and in the coordination and patterns of regular daily life, even mundane activity. With rhythm's presence being constantly accentuated, it has evolved to be as inseparable to life as breathing. The music of sub-Saharan Africa is mostly communal in nature. The music usually has a context: religious music, work songs, dance music, music for ritual, celebration, etc. People participate together in the music making. The intention is generally not for some to perform and others to listen. Another fairly reliable generalization is the idea that one element of the music interlocks with something else. A preacher's call and a congregation's response is this idea on a basic level, but the principle continues into the smallest details of musical construction and perception. As players add their parts, which interlock with other parts, a melody or a fascinating pattern is revealed, not because somebody played it, but because it results from the composite, and one becomes aware of it as it floats by and catches the attention. In Awe drumming of West Africa, a guiding rhythm, often played by a metallic bell, is heard as a pattern of specific length and is continually repeated. Then the soundscape brings in various drums and other instruments, each playing a unique rhythm, some of 4 beats, some in patterns of 3 beats, and other patterns freely invented. A lead drummer adds rhythmic improvisations that serve to energize the composite effect. Overall, the music has a fast triplet feel, as one might experience in a 12/8 meter, with audible lines made up of larger values, duple patterns, slower speeds, and bursts of independent energy. In northern Ghana, some of the drums are carved into an hourglass shape and rigged with straps that, when squeezed, stretch the skins of the drum. The drums imitate speech and are played with a curved stick. More to the south on the continent, in areas of and around Zimbabwe, the Shona people use the kalimba and the mbira, instruments that outside of Africa might be called a thumb piano. Made with metal prongs attached to a base with bottle cap rattlers, it is played with both hands. As in the Ewe drumming, players gather to interweave their parts into a complex texture. Because such music is communal, it invites participation. It can be created with just a few players, or it can grow to include a whole community. It is by nature improvisatory, and often its form comes from the collective input, not from someone's given roadmap. Therefore, there isn't a clear beginning, middle, and an end. An entirely different kind of music comes from the Mande people who live around Mali and Gambia. Here one finds the bridge harp, called a kora. It is a large, tall instrument that physically looks similar to other ethnic stringed instruments, but the strings are strung on a plane that is perpendicular to the instrument's body. The instrument is played by both hands, one on each side of the strings. Music of the soil reveals different ways to think about sound, the organization of sound, and the purpose of music itself. And as the world continued to get smaller in the 20th century and since, these individual ethnic musical styles and ideas became increasingly part of a whole, which we know as human diversity. The composers of the 20th century opened their ears to all of it, and music became a messy stew with lots of flavors. America especially became an interesting kitchen. America has a native population, plus immigration that came from Africa, Asia, and Europe. It borrowed from all these cultures as it tried to find one of its own. In the next few episodes, we'll explore the collision of influences that became the American culture, which in turn has again influenced the world culture.
Nankala Jimbo, Jimmy Sembalo, Sunny Jimbo, Jimmy Sembalo, Sunny Jimbo, Jimmy Sembalo, Sunny Jimbo, Jimmy Sembalo. Nankala Jimbo, Jimmy Sembalo, Sunny Jimbo, Temala, Sunny Jimbo, Jimmy Sembalo, Sunny Jimbo, Jimmy Sembalo. Atali manan dunia sangko ba kunda kunyo dia ada nyanjo masane. Fode kunda kunyo dia ada nyanjo masane. Kita betul lagi ya baliga. Badia nyanjo algambe dile. Waya nyanjo famala mane swara di ma famala mane nyanjo banda. Dunia sana balama ni kumalimbe tomare na basana balama balika ngan sugilan jema wajambe ni usale malam bala fe mane yung kamando malam bala fe mane yung kamando